This episode is brought to you by Sacred Rights, which provides support, resources, and networks for religion scholars committed to translating their research to a broader audience. You can find more information about their work at sacred-rights.org. Thank you so much for joining me. This is Greg Soden. My guest on this episode is Dr. Ganga Kieffer. Ganga Kieffer is visiting assistant professor of religious studies at Wesleyan University and received her PhD from Boston University in 2023. She studies contemporary American spiritualities, health, gender, and marketing. On this episode, we are discussing her first book, Unvaccinated Under God: Religion and Vaccine Hesitancy in Modern America. The book is a history of religion and vaccine skepticism, and it is out from Princeton University Press. She has written for Religion and Politics, The Los Angeles Times, The Washington Post, Religion for Breakfast, and more. It is my pleasure to bring you this conversation, so please enjoy this episode with Dr. Ganga Kieffer. Dr. Ganga Kieffer, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
I'm delighted that you're here. I'm wondering if we can kick this off by having you just introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners out there so they know just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. So I am a scholar of religious studies. I study American religious history as it relates to and intertwines with health, medicine, and politics and spirituality. So I have done a lot of work studying vaccine hesitancy and religion in American culture, but I've also done some work and studies of spirituality in American culture.
Excellent. I'd love to know a little bit about your background in scholarship as well. What is kind of like the journey of finding your areas of academic interest over the years? Like what are some major stepping stones along your story there?
Sure. Yes, it's always interesting to know how people get to exactly the spot that they land. So I was a freshman in college back in 2004, and that was the year that George W. Bush was elected, one of the years. And I was completely, I was just an 18-year-old flummoxed by the role of evangelicals in politics and in Republican politics. I didn't understand. And I was from a New York City suburb in Connecticut, and that was not my world. And so when I was in college, I had the opportunity to take a class with Randall Balmer at Columbia, and it blew my mind. I didn't know that religion and politics were so heavily intertwined, if not inseparable. And so I took some courses with him there, and I thought, that's awesome. I ended up moving on to Brown and finished out my undergrad there. I studied religion and history, and I did an honors thesis there with evangelicals and kind of studying evangelical culture. And then I went into marketing after college, and I wasn't going to do anything more with my religious studies, but life happened. And somehow, some way, I got brought back 10 years later to start in 2014 at BU as a doctoral student. And what really I think what was really formative for me there was that as you dig into doctoral studies, you start to see where you have a strong resonance, where the material or where the ideas make a lot of sense to you. And but you also want to be able to explain them to other people. And I started to find that was the case for me with alternative spirituality and alternative health in particular.
Mhm.
So, we're back in, say, the 2014, 2015, 2016, and we've got wellness culture really ramping up even further, and people are really starting to get more interested in alternative health. But to many academics and many in the universities, they're like, I don't know anything about this. I don't really get this. And I said, I do get this. I did a lot of alternative health as a child. My mom was very interested in our kind of family health history, brought us into a lot of alternative health and medicine spaces.
Mm.
And I innately understood so much of the culture. And so, what had started out as me being interested in evangelical politics ended up becoming me being able to explain, not be an apologist for it, but really explain and be interested in contextualizing where do alternative perspectives on health and medicine come from? And how are they also religious? And so I just really took that and ran with it. And I was going to do a dissertation. I'll wrap it up, but I was going to do a dissertation with three case studies on alternative health. And one of them was going to be on vaccine hesitancy. And that was not the whole focus. I ended up starting that case study first, presented at the American Academy of Religion in November 2019, and had a lot of people interested, especially middle aged women who were scholars at the conference, come up to me and say, "This was really interesting. No one talks about this. I also think I was hesitant when I was vaccinating my kids. I did it, but I was hesitant." I
Mm.
said, this is resonant. And then what do you know? COVID starts like 3 or 4 months later. And I could tell that it was going to be a disaster because I had been studying vaccine hesitancy culture. And I knew that I could see the science right away.
Oh, that is so interesting. And that culminates in a brand new book, Unvaccinated Under God, Religion, and Vaccine Hesitancy in Modern America, which is coming out in May of 2026 from Princeton University Press. So congratulations on that. I'd love to know, like, set the stage a little bit for this book. You mentioned how it came about, and then COVID happens, and you have a great little anecdote in the beginning of the book of being in Bourne, and seeing some protests in Massachusetts start to spring up. So how does that go for you when it really starts to click in place, when you're seeing it happen before your very eyes and you're realizing, I know this is what's going to happen, and here it is in front of my very eyes. Tell me a little bit about that moment.
Yes. So if you remember back to those early days of COVID and everybody's in lockdown, everybody's quarantining, and I'm sure you all were doing the social distance walks. So my husband and I were living in Massachusetts. We were both in graduate school, and we had the Cape Cod was about an hour away. We used to love to get out to the beach, and so we would drive from Mansfield, Mass, over the bridge to Cape Cod, and that right over the bridge in Cape Cod is Bourne, Massachusetts. And every weekend that we would drive out there, there were protesters out in the Dunkin' Donuts parking lot right at the roundabout. And they were protesting vehemently against masking and against lockdowns. And they were angry at the governor of Massachusetts for having lockdowns and having all these rules. And I noticed right away, and this was just in kind of early, maybe April of 2020, they were all wearing Trump gear.
Mm.
So it was anti-masking, anti-lockdown, also MAGA, also we love Trump. And so it was like a Trump party outside, but also with a lot of anger and a lot of shouting at people into the roundabout. And
Mm.
I was really honestly very disturbed at that point and felt very scared by the idea of the protesters against masking, because masking felt to me to be, the thing to do and felt safe and felt protective. And they were saying masking is terrible and masking is taking away our freedom and our ability to be, humans. And so when I started seeing that, I thought, if they don't like masking, then they're really not going to like vaccines. And I published an article, basically a couple of articles actually arguing that. And I was approached by Princeton University Press by my editor, Fred Apple. And he said, "I think this is really an interesting take. Maybe you would want to write a book on it." And I said, "I will absolutely love to do that. I'll scrap those other alternative medicine ideas for the dissertation, and I'll kind of combine the two." So I wrote a book.
Wonderful. Well, and those ideas are still there too. When you
Mhm.
get to those eventually, they'll still be around and you can still write about them again in the future. So it's awesome that you were able to dive deep on this one and had the opportunity to do so. So, something that was really interesting to me when I was reading the book is that I had no idea about the origins of vaccine hesitancy in the United States at all. Um, Obviously, I've seen it take shape in public discourse in the last 5, 6 years. But this is not really something I ever had to pay attention to, and I never did. So when you start writing about the hesitancy in the US against smallpox in the 18th century, I was like, there's so much history here that I have no idea about. So, what do listeners need to know about the origins of vaccine hesitancy in the United States in general?
So I'll give you the quick and dirty on vaccine hesitancy in the 18th century and kind of in the early years of vaccines. And the real takeaway is that from the moment there were vaccines, there were hesitant people. And so even with the precursor to vaccines of inoculation, which is kind of a gross process, but effective, it was people saying this feels ungodly, this feels satanic, this feels
Mhm.
devilish, this feels transformative in a not good way.
Hmm.
And so so I started looking at some um, kind of early like cartoons and like political cartoons that then like came out in like the 19th century and early 20th century. You can see it all along pop-up groups, not huge movements, but pop-up groups, anti-vaccinationist societies in the early 20th century, again, saying this is transformative in that it turns children into something that isn't children, something corruptive. And the route that people took in those days was either satanic or it turned them into some sort of animal or it turned them into being like wards of the state or some sort of child that was not of theirs anymore. And so then that kind of dovetails into a parental rights vibe in the early 20th century. But we see a huge biomedical revolution in the early 20th century. Everybody starts getting involved with biomedicine or Western medicine as there's huge technological advances, and you see that dying down, that anti-vaccinationism dying down quite a lot. It doesn't go away, but it really does get to its smallest point of relevance, say the 50s and around the Salk polio vaccine. You don't see too much angst over that because people are really in the throes of being happy with Western medicine. And then by where my book starts, is in 1982. We see a huge moment where vaccine hesitancy or this was called the vaccine safety movement comes about because people have a very particular concern. So it's not so much about anti-vaxxing the way that it was in the earlier days, where it was like vaccination is iffy for all those reasons, whether it be sort of a vaguely religious reason or some sort of pollution reason that like pollutes the child. It starts to be more targeted to particular vaccines might be unsafe becomes the concern. So we should fix those particular vaccines. And that's really where the modern history starts in the 80s.
Excellent. We'll come back to that, I think, in a little bit because I
Hmm.
do have questions about that. But there's a couple terms in the book that I really want to solidify. Vaccine hesitancy versus vaccine refusal. Is there any play here or difference between them? Because I see them come up both in the book, and I wonder if we can just kind of clarify those terms.
Yes. So both of those terms, and I'll explain both, but both those terms I think are kind of almost scholarly reactions to the popular terminology of anti-vaxxing. So when we'll come back to that history, but say in the 80s and the 90s, early 2000s, you have people in the public starting to cast doubts or questions or even have pretty strong opposition to certain vaccines, and they be at first are given quite a lot of runway in the public press, and then very quickly, like say a decade, shut down, and they are termed anti-vaxxers. And like basically that old timey anti-vaccinationists that people wore proudly back in the early 20th century, it ends up becoming a pejorative or derogatory term. And so that's a really broad term, that's a derogatory term. And it wasn't actually reflecting where these people were coming from. So as you start to see scholars prior to myself, like social scientists, public health people studying, okay, what are these people doing? What's their whole orientation? Starts to be um, fleshed out to say, okay, they're not necessarily anti. meaning totally oppositional to vaccination, because vaccination is a set of practices, right? It's a set of, the whole following the whole public health CDC's, well, that's all tricky now, but following the official public health recommendations of childhood vaccination would be what, you would think is an anti-vaxxer would be someone who doesn't want to do that.
Mm.
Most people aren't like that. So most people who are concerned about vaccines are hesitant. They want to think about it more. They have some fears, they have some doubts, they have some concerns, but they usually go ahead and do it because it is the law. Refusers are those who say, I'm not going to do that one for my child or myself. I refuse it. I will use a legal exemption if I need to in order to get out of that requirement.
Excellent. Okay, so for me, I am not a religious person. Say that I had some hesitancy to do vaccinations of some kind, but not from a religious perspective. So to me, I see a few different angles here. We have like a traditional and explicitly religious hesitancy versus, maybe somebody like me versus maybe some kind of non-traditional or maybe implicitly religious comparison. What are there's like a few lanes here. Can you like shake these out for me?
Yeah, so those are the kind of lanes that I try to delineate in my book because it all gets very confusing when you look at what I mentioned those legal exemptions before. What does it take to get a legal exemption from a mandatory vaccine, say that you need a child to have to go to public school? Well, the state, actually every state has the ability to receive one of those exemptions, but they're actually labeled religious exemptions and or personal belief exemptions in some cases. And so that's the origin story of exemptions, is that they were created by people who said they had an overtly religious reason to abstain from vaccines, and it became the law that that was how you coded it. And so that's a whole tricky part of it. But so um, when you look at who are those quote traditional groups that oppose vaccines, you come up with basically none. Even the Church of Christ Scientists or Christian Scientists, who are say the groups that were especially interested in obtaining those exemptions back in the 1960s and who wanted that legal exemption, they're not opposed to vaccines, but they think that people shouldn't have to get them.
Hmm.
The Catholics don't say you can't get vaccines. Orthodox Jews don't say you can't get vaccines. Nearly any group, any traditional religious group, Catholics, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, no one, Muslims, no one's saying you shouldn't get vaccines. In fact, most traditional institutional religions say you should get vaccines. It's a public good. It helps people. Even if you feel a little iffy on it, it's something you should do. So that's where that religious nomenclature gets a little surprising. We'll see how that plays out later, I'm sure, but in the interview. But I think that the implicit is what you're getting at too, which is what I call what is subtle or implicit non-traditional religiosity, which is that in American culture we have a very religious culture. It's predominantly Protestant vibes. But it's not only. And we have a lot of ways of talking about our feelings and ways of talking about morality, ways of talking about what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong, that are very infused with religious ideas, whether they be Christian or alternative spirituality. I'd say they're kind of the biggies for like most mass America, and certainly public conversation. And so when we say things like it's impure or it's pure or it's pollutive or it's beneficial, like these kinds of like distinctions that are have a moral quality to them, I think those are coming very much from a religious place, but not necessarily from any one doctrine. Or it feels right to me. It's spiritual. I feel like it's just right. It has a bigger meaning than just, taking Tylenol, right? If you kind of say like, oh, do you take Tylenol and treat your kids' fevers with Tylenol? Yeah. Do you give them antibiotics? Yeah. Vaccines? There's something bigger about that. That's where you start getting into what I call as implicit religiosity, which is like, is it existential?
Hmm.
Where does that come from? And I think that that's something that we need to pay a lot more attention to and give a lot more, we pay short shrift to it in a way. And I think we should pay more attention to it.
How do you see the book as reformulating vaccine hesitancy in the United States? Do you feel like there's a reformulation here?
Absolutely. So I'd say that a number of important scholars prior to my work were trying to say vaccine hesitancy is, has a lot of historical context. Vaccine hesitancy isn't necessarily, we shouldn't just say it's bad and kind of bring the hammer down on it because it's anti-public health, and did a really good job of humanizing it. My book is taking a new perspective, but in that same vein, but saying, actually, let's analyze it as religion. Let's analyze vaccine hesitancy, refusal, and opposition, all on like a spectrum: hesitancy, refusal, opposition, as a set of like religious impulses that are then enacted through how you vaccinate.
Mm.
We see that vaccination and giving shots, especially to children, which that's like the most moral of grounds, is how you deal with children in our culture. And so we want to see, how do people talk about those decisions? How do they talk about their qualms or concerns? And we see, hey, they're actually very religious, and they draw upon very religious frameworks and tools that are super common in our culture, but we don't necessarily say, oh, that's because they are a Christian or that's because they're Jewish. It's not like that. So I'm saying vaccine hesitancy is a religious expression, and we should look at it that way. And so I take a historical approach and an analytical approach where I show this is how it develops over time, over 50 years. And if we put a religion lens on it, here's what we'd see.
Mm. So I was born in 1983, and you mentioned 1982 earlier. I would love to know if there's any major turning points between 1982 and kind of how we came to be where we are today. So if there's any like major events, we could just kind of like list those.
Mhm.
Because I'm super interested in the inability to have political common ground in the United States today, but I feel like we need to talk a little bit about 1982 to now in order to do that.
Absolutely. So, and that's really important ground to start on because we're starting in 19, if we start in 1982, where the book starts, we have a kind of a media event, honestly, where you have this release of a documentary on broadcast news, and it's called DPT Vaccine Roulette. And it comes out in April of 1982. It basically asserts through some very visual and kind of very scary, disturbing visuals that there is a faulty component to the diphtheria pertussis tetanus vaccine, which is commonly given to all children in multiple doses, and that some children, when they receive that vaccine, they have neurological defects or damages that come as a result of the vaccine. This was broadcast in 1982. It goes bananas. People are fascinated and terrified and say, what on earth is the government doing? What are my doctors doing? How do I know if I can trust them? And a set of people start to get together, and they quickly form a group called Dissatisfied Parents Together. They rename that about 10 or so years later into National Vaccine Information Center, which is still very much prominent today. So this is like 50 years in running with that same group. And they say, we need to look into this particular vaccine and make sure that it is safe. And they fight for legislation that kind of goes along with that particular concern. It seems to resolve ish. There's always some people who hold on and say, like, I still don't know if I like this, but it resolves. And then in 1997, we have another big flashpoint where the FDA puts out a kind of a statement that they are going to remove mercury from all food and drug products. And it doesn't take long for some people to say, hey, actually, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine actually contains a form of mercury. And if the US government wants that taken out of stuff, what could it be doing? And
Mm.
so you've got the people who are maybe concerned before, and then a whole host of new folks that say, I've got issues. My kid also has issues, and I think they happened after this vaccination. And, we haven't really called it autism yet, but that's the word that's coming, which is this set of amorphous developmental delays or neurological deficits and behavioral deficits or distinctions or differences. It's all muddled together because this is not proven out in the medical world or medical science. At the same time in 97, terrible coincidence, we have the debunked scientist Andrew Wakefield, who publishes that very disturbing and flawed study that linked the MMR vaccine to autism related uh, health problems in children. And so those two events in 97 basically catalyze a whole new bunch of people, really led by the actress Jenny McCarthy. If you probably know her if you're born in the 80s and then, growing up in the 90s,
MTV.
she had a lot of credibility because she was speaking out, not because she was such a credible person on her own, but because when she started speaking about her identity as a mother and as her identity as someone who had a mother, who was a mother of a child who was struggling, and that she was going to devote her entire life to helping get better, and that the vaccine was potentially to blame in his illness, it was extremely resonant. And so you have Larry King, Oprah, Phil Donahue. I mean, every person who had a big platform was covering Jenny. Jenny was everywhere, and she was writing books and really speaking to a lot of mothers who were fearful about either their children's current health concerns or what could happen to them. So that was a big flashpoint. And that really sticks because MMR autism theory debunked so many times. That whole study retracted, and it didn't make a dent in people's feelings about whether this could possibly be true. In fact, it just fuels them uh, in large part because distrust of medical authorities is kind of starting to go down because we're seeing so much chronic illness diagnosis, especially among children. And so there seems to be higher rates of child chronic illnesses and no answers. And so
Mm.
in that vacuum over 90s, 2000s, 2010s, you're going to see more and more people have these very personal, very like emotional, very religious feelings and orientations as ways of describing what they think is happening. They think they have a conversion experience where they suddenly know this is what it was. It was the vaccine, or they
Mm.
want to tell people, they testify or they witness about it. Those are evangelical Christian words, but it really explains the way that they speak about it to others.
Yeah, when you write about the 2010s in the book and you write about the ultra-Orthodox Jews and the evangelicals talking about vaccine hesitancy as a moral commitment, phew, that really struck me. So what do listeners need to know about that 2010s pushback? Because as the moral commitment, because I know there was some legislation stuff that became involved and it gets pretty messy.
Right. So if you follow that Jenny McCarthy led mothers movement, she calls it the Mother Warriors, and I think that's a great term
So
to
catchy.
describe it. So catchy. I mean, perfect. And I used it from my own book as well, in one of the chapters. The Mother Warriors are capitalizing on intensive mothering, which is the predominant way of mothering, that's being taught and practiced in American culture. You treat your child as though they're a sacred being. You control every aspect of what goes in them. You make them into a, perfect little person. And that is who is the predominant group of vaccine hesitant people up through the 2010s. But under the radar, we start to see, and this is what I think you're getting at, that there are suddenly outbreaks of measles in Orthodox Jewish communities in Brooklyn and upstate New York, among Amish people in Ohio, among a faith healing church in Texas, among Somali Muslim refugees in Minneapolis. These are not groups that hang out.
Hmm.
These are not groups that are all sharing, the same air and then spreading measles. And so we wonder all of a sudden, public health researchers are like, where's all this coming from? It must be a religious thing. And as I noted, it's not necessarily, quote, a traditional religious thing, but it's a enclave set apart community thing where people who feel set apart and othered by mainstream America and by the government and by medical authorities start to kind of really resonate with those mother warriors who are saying, hey, we think something's wrong with our kids and no one cares. No one can help them. And actually, we see the same thing happening in those enclave groups. And because of that, the media, in unfortunately, and also public health too, a bit unfortunately, says, oh, anti-vaxxers, here again using that term, anti-vaxxers are religious because they identified religion with those bigger named groups, even though they're very tiny subgroups. And so then all of a sudden, after a measles outbreak from Disneyland in 2015, the state of California says, you know what? Too many people are using exemptions. And you know what? Those are religious exemptions, and religion and medicine shouldn't mix. Let's get rid of those. We want to just repeal those laws, ditch them. And that's really led by Democrats. It's a liberal state. And people all over the country say, oh my God, that is not good. We have been using those laws. We've been using those exemptions because we've been vaccine hesitant and we wanted to be careful. And it turns out there was a lot of people in those enclave religious communities who were using them, not because their rabbis were telling them to, not because their imams were telling them to, but because they felt like the information they had from fellow moms was pushing them in that direction. And suddenly other states want to follow suit and say, you know what, we don't want measles around. The idea of measles feels outdated and religion kind of feels outdated. And so let's just get rid of religious exemptions. And states like Washington, Oregon, Idaho, I mean, all over New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, everywhere across the board start proposing laws to repeal those. And people get mad. They are storming the capitals. This is like, it creates a grassroots movement that didn't even really exist because of the fear of having the exemptions taken away.
Mm.
They fight back in almost every single state where this starts to happen, Texas, and they're successful. They're successful because America and the United States protects religion. It's in the First Amendment. Religion is protected. We are a religious country. We support it, right? And the idea of taking that away, something that says a religious exemption, is very, very frightening and portends a domino effect for people who have a strong commitment to religious freedom. And that is a whole other group known as evangelical Christians who are very, very involved in protecting religious freedom in the 2010s. And so,
Mm.
boom, you have a new coalition, vaccine hesitant people from all random communities all over the country who want to be able to abstain from vaccines, possibly, not even necessarily, but they want the ability. And then evangelical Christians who just want to protect religious freedom. And now you have a new coalition that's born grassroots from basically every state in the nation right in 2019.
Wow. Okay. So 2019 to now, I mean, is a very unique time. Obviously, everybody knows it, everybody feels it, everybody has their opinions on it. As far as the book goes, what do we need to know about the Biden years and the return of Trump with RFK as his Secretary for Health and Human Services? What do we need to know about these trends in society with where we are right now?
Well, obviously we have COVID happen, going back to that, the mask, the anti-masking, the anti-lockdowns that I was referring to earlier in the conversation. And that's driven by Make America Great Again folks who are Trump supporters, who are freedom warriors. They don't want the state involved in their lives. They don't want, even when Trump's in charge of the state, they don't want the state involved in their lives. And then COVID hits, everybody starts to divide over how to deal with this pandemic over very political divisions. And vaccines gets caught right in the middle of that for obvious reasons, given it's at the center of everybody's mind and world. But nowhere ever had vaccines been a political or politically partisan topic ever in American history, really. Everything I've described till now in our conversation has not revolved around partisan politics, Democrats and Republicans, until the little those potential repeals in California and New York, et cetera, by Democrats. And so after Trump leaves the first term and Biden comes in, he says, basically, I'm paraphrasing here, but he's basically like, I'm the public health president. I am the pro science president. I support and believe in science. I support doctors who represent science. And something that I think is really notable is the partisanship that happens. If you're a Democrat or a liberal or progressive, you become someone who trusts or believes in science. And if you're a Republican or a conservative or a MAGA supporter, you believe in personal freedom, not necessarily science, not necessarily faith, not necessarily God, but personal freedom. So what's the dichotomy there? And Biden is saying, hey, science is all about protecting everybody. That's like the quintessential public health axiom. It's like we protect the good of the many and some of the few have to sacrifice. And that some of the few have to sacrifice was something that no one ever talked about until we got up to the pandemic. And by no one ever, I mean like in the past 100 years. And so Republicans and conservatives start to say, we don't believe in that. We don't believe in the personal sacrifice part because we need to have our own freedom. We need medical freedom. We need medical liberty. It goes along with religious liberty. It goes along with religious freedom. These are all terms that become very much enmeshed and very much descriptive of the MAGA movement. And that was a situation that even I did not exactly predict to happen with that much fervor. And what ended up then happening with kind of Trump's return through the Biden era, where you see that Biden is pushing this trust and belief, very religious-y terms, actually, the belief in science. It's like, just believe in it. Believe in the people who know better than you. And that's a very deferential ask, really. It's requiring a lot of trust. And when people don't trust the powers that be, then why would they believe in them? And that's what was, I think, very much overlooked by Biden. But I don't want to blame it just on Biden, but like by Democrats and kind of writ large for over 10 years, and to the detriment, honestly. But that's a bit of a side note.
Yeah.
And we see RFK Jr., who was all along, he was alongside those mother warriors back in the 90s. He was writing about vaccines being unsafe. And he had a long-standing allegiance and community amongst vaccine hesitant people. And they powered him through in a way that gave that whole like very kind of seen as an undercurrent, the vaccine hesitant folks who are, the anti-vaxxers, like the bad people that don't vaccinate their children and, they're therefore bring measles back. He becomes their spokesperson and he says, hey, we weren't trying to hurt people. We were trying to protect kids. So he says, we're trying to protect kids. That's a great message. He says, you know what? Everybody's been overlooking that there's a lot of chronic illness amongst our children, amongst our population, which is undeniable. And people are listening. people say that makes a lot of sense to me. And we also know we've got a huge wellness community growing and growing and growing and growing because people want to have control over their health. They want to feel like they can live longer, live better, be healthier. They want answers that traditional doctors can't necessarily give them. And it's another coalition is built amongst people who are wellness devotees and people who have been vaccine hesitant, who are also now really concerned about religious freedom.
Amazing. Well, Dr. Kira Kieffer, what an amazing overview and primer. Like I feel like I have like a grasp now on like the 1800s and 1700s almost like up to now. And so what a great conversation. The book is Unvaccinated Under God, Religion and Vaccine Hesitancy in Modern America, which listeners can get from Princeton University Press. Dr. Kira Kieffer, thank you so much for joining me. What a fabulous conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun, and I hope you learned a lot.